Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Currently Speaking. This is the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. I'm Bill Current, president and founder of the Current Consulting Group, and I'm joined again today by Brian Feely, vice president of the Current Consulting Group. Welcome, Brian.
Oh, thanks, Bill.
And so this is another in our ongoing series on oral fluid testing. Hopefully you've seen some of the past episodes, but you can find them on our website at currentconsultinggroup.com. And you can find Currently Speaking, our podcast, at all the major podcast platforms, Amazon, Audible, YouTube, you name it, we're on those platforms. So visit us at any of those platforms, share and like. We're trying to build up our followership. And we would welcome any input that you have on how we can improve the podcast to make it more useful to you. So today we're going to talk about, in the context of oral fluid testing, we're going to talk about some of the aspects of the new DOT oral fluid testing regulations. And Brian, let's start just with the most basic question, which is, now employers will soon have access to lab-based oral fluid testing as part of those DOT regulations. What does that mean for employers?
Well, so it means a couple things. Obviously, if you're in the regulated sectors, which would include federal or DOT, any of the DOT modalities, you'll be able to use oral fluid for all the various drug testing purposes that are, part of the typical applications. And then for, obviously for the non-regulated markets, I think what it means, employers, it means that they're, the oral fluid has been further validated, right, at the federal level and by the DOT, which should give people a lot of comfort about the validity and the overall scientific credibility of oral fluid. From a testing standpoint, it's been well vetted, right? Because it's now in the federal guidelines, and DOT has issued their rulemaking process, and that's done. And so, just to close the loop, the delay right now has to do with some of the things we're going to talk about on this podcast, right? So the delay is getting the right oral fluid collection device and the right assays to the laboratories for them to validate and for them to get inspected. Because right now, the way the different specifications were set up by SAMHSA initially, and then we all kind of waited for DOT to issue their proposed rulemaking. It created a bit of a delay because you couldn't necessarily start your whole development process for the device or your assays unless you knew what the DOT was going to say. Were they going to be in lockstep with HHS, or might there be some differences between things like the collection device, for example, and the collection device procedure? And it turns out, sure enough, there are some differences.
So in past episodes of Currently Speaking, you've talked about some of the unique attributes of oral fluid testing, one of them being the ability to detect use within minutes after somebody's ingested a drug, recent use detection. So these new DOT regulations, based in part on the SAMHSA guidelines that came out in October of 2019, would make oral fluid testing, specifically lab-based oral fluid testing, really the only government-endorsed recent use detection drug testing method, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Bill.
And that should give employers some level of comfort, whether it's part of a DOT-mandated program or outside of that, knowing that the government has essentially come out and said, we trust this drug testing method.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when you look at some of the state laws as they're evolving in states like California and Washington, of course, they've implemented laws that really zero in on a parent drug for THC, a parent drug test. You can't test for the metabolite anymore. So that parent drug is THC, Delta 9 THC, right? And that's the most indicative of recent use. So it all kind of ties together and is a pretty good indicator of, where our market's going when it comes to marijuana testing.
So as an employer looks at these DOT regulations, they're gonna see some similarities, at least in the process of a test, that would compare to the longstanding urine guidelines that have been part of the DOT regulations for 3 decades plus now. So let's start with that. Tell us about the collection process of an oral fluid sample, and specifically about the devices and what the requirements would be to qualify for as an approved oral fluid collection device.
Yeah. Okay. So to do that, we have to do a little bit of a contrast of SAMHSA versus DOT, right? So there's a lot of similarities in the guidelines, the HHS guidelines, and the overall the DOT guidelines. So what are some of the things in common? Number one, the collection device itself has to collect an oral fluid sample of at least 1 ml, and it has to have a volume indicator telling you when you've collected that 1 ml. It has to have a vial that's sealable, non-leaking. It has to have a sufficiently transparent, I think they call it, sufficiently transparent look to the vial or material used, so that one can see the contents of what's in the vial, meaning the oral fluid sample, right? That there isn't junk in there, or somebody hasn't tried to add something. There has to be stability of, I think it's in the specs, 80% recovery of drugs and 80% stability of that drug. And that has to be for a 5-day period. So those are all in common between, DOT basically adopted the SAMHSA guidelines, and all of those things they've kept in common related to, and the cutoffs. So the cutoffs, the vial, the ability, the need to collect 1 ml, the need for a volume indicator, all those things are common between SAMHSA and DOT. Oh, and there's one other thing. So that that all kind of referred to the neat oral fluid sample. What does neat mean? That essentially means if you were to spit into a tube right now and not have any buffer or any components in there, that's whole saliva, or neat, right? So the 1 ml was kind of locked in based on neat saliva, and you have to have at least 1 ml. If you use a diluent or a buffer, like many of the companies do when they develop the collection devices, because this helps to stabilize the sample, helps it to, for shipping and all those things. If you use a buffer, the amount of oral fluid, that 1 ml, now has to be plus or minus 10% on the volume, because you're putting it into a buffer. And your buffer has to be plus or minus 2.5% volume, which is not a big deal. The plus or minus 2.5% is pretty easy to hit for a manufacturer. The 10%, plus or minus 10% on the oral fluid volume, gets a little tricky. Now, where do they differ? So when you look at the SAMHSA guidelines, the federal guidelines say if you're doing that collection with an oral fluid collection device, you can essentially use 2 devices that each collect 1 ml, right? And so you could have a left and a right collection going on, where they at least collect 1 ml, and you could do that simultaneously, or I could do it serially. So I could collect 1 device, right, get my first sample A, and I could do the second device after that and get a B sample. DOT did not allow for that. DOT said no, because of the Omnibus Act and all of the things related to the way a urine specimen has been collected over many, many years. It's a single sample that you can then split. Right. So in the DOT guidelines, they say you shall collect a single oral fluid sample and have that subdivided in the presence of the donor into an A and a B sample. And so that's different. Right. So if you have been following HHS guidelines as a developer all along, you'd be thinking, OK, we're good. We can do 2 devices. We could potentially do serial or simultaneous. And then the DOT guidelines come out and say, no, you can't do that. So that's the reason for the delay, because a lot of people waited for those DOT guidelines to hit. So there's some other nuances in there. It would take us probably an hour podcast to go through all of them. But essentially, those are the main similarities and differences that people need to be aware of. And, finally, here we are waiting for at least two labs to be certified. And I can go into that a little more if that's of interest, but I wasn't sure what you're going to ask next.
Well, so we do hear a lot from our good friend Patrice Kelly, who is, was really sort of the force behind this at DOT and now also works with NDASA, that we're waiting for 2 laboratories to be certified for oral fluid testing before employers can start using it. But we've also heard at the same time some anecdotal incidents of employers thinking that they can already do lab-based oral fluid testing as part of DOT compliance and sending these oral fluid testing samples to the laboratory only to have them rejected. So what's the process for these laboratories getting certified, and what's the timeline for it? It seems to be the major holdup.
Yeah. So it just to go back to the comment of people starting to send in samples, it's on one hand, not surprising because everybody has heard we've got approval. There's HHS guidelines, the DOT issued their formal rulemaking and all that stuff. So if you're not particularly wired into the industry and you're not necessarily paying close attention, you could think, hey, it's approved, let's go, let's start doing it, right? Especially if it's solving some issues for you, you want to get to that pretty quick. On the other hand, the whole industry, including us and all of the associations and providers, have been very much vocal and publicly speaking about what's next and the need to wait and all that sort of stuff. So, people just need to stay wired into our networks, into the industry, into the associations to listen up for what really will be the go ahead, which is 2 labs being certified. So what does that mean? First of all, you have to have that device that I described, right? And the assays that hit the cutoffs. They have to go through the FDA for approval. And they have to then get into the hands of the laboratories who are going to validate the device and the assays. And they have to be able to show that they're hitting the criteria that I talked about. So they have to look at the device. Is it really coming in? Can I read the expiration date? Is it stable? Are they hitting the volume requirements? All those things are part of what they will need to show when a lab gets inspected. Right. So there's a group of inspectors that go around, of course, and inspect SAMHSA certified laboratories. And so they're going to have all that data to show that they did the testing, the device hit the specs, the assays are working, the controls are falling into place and all that sort of stuff. So and the whole bit about it being 2 labs, it doesn't matter whether it's, a Quest lab and a CRL lab, or whether it's an Abbott lab and a, LabCorp lab. All it matters is that there's 2 labs that are currently testing the same device and the same assays, and they validated it so that there can be a primary lab and a secondary lab for challenge testing or for, the split specimen testing part. So that's what we're waiting for, is the devices, the FDA approval of those, the labs to get certified. It's anybody's guess when that's going to happen, Bill. Could be later this year, although my crystal ball is a little foggy on this. It's indicating more like 2025 sometime.
So I know, again, you're not claiming to have a crystal ball on these things, but part of our,
I do have a crystal ball.
Oh, there you go. Okay, good. Let's use that for a second.
Yeah, it's just a little foggy right now on this whole topic.
So now, every year, the Current Consulting Group does a survey of the drug testing industry. And in 2019, let me go back a couple of years, maybe 2018, 2017, about 39% of drug testing providers in our survey said that they, at that time, were offering oral fluid drug testing, either lab-based or rapid oral fluid testing. And then by last year, we were up to about 87%. And I think a lot of companies in the drug testing industry were probably reacting to or trying to get ahead of the curve a little bit with these DOT regulations. One of the other questions we asked was, in the future, which drug testing method will be most used? And 46%, this is in last year's survey, 46% said urine, and 46% said oral fluid. The first time oral fluid had ever tied with urine. It was always urine by a large margin, and then the gap started closing in a little bit and shrinking. So my question to you is, with these DOT regulations, they exist now. Of course, we're still waiting for certain things to happen, but the DOT oral fluid regulations exist. And it's given probably, I think we can attribute this boost in the percentage of providers that offer oral fluid testing. A lot of it can be attributed to DOT endorsing lab-based oral fluid testing. So my question to you is, going forward, do you see oral fluid testing becoming much more dominant in terms of the type of specimen that employers choose to use?
Yes, I do. I do, Bill. I think that there are just so many advantages to the collection part of this, right? Where the ease of the collection of an oral fluid sample is just really, really strong. The 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 ability to pick up recent use, which we know is now becoming very important in the industry because of things like marijuana, and it's even important with other drugs. To be honest with you, it's not just all about marijuana, although it seems to be these days in our industry. Recent use of other things like heroin and methamphetamine and other dangerous drugs are also important. So you have that ease of use of the collection, the recent use aspect, and it's really difficult to cheat on an oral fluid drug test. So there are a variety of other things that you can throw in there. There could even be some cost savings realized depending upon how you're doing the collection. If you're going to a patient service center, for example, a collection site, it's an awful lot quicker to collect an oral fluid sample typically. So you have all of those possible benefits. So it's hard to believe that it won't overtake urine drug screening in the long run, and not by a little, probably by a lot.
Okay. Anything to add before we close this episode?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
All right, Brian, thank you again. And thank you, everybody, for viewing this episode of Currently Speaking. Again, if you have questions about drug testing, questions about oral fluid testing in particular, or the new DOT regulations, contact us at Current Consulting Group. You can find our contact information at currentconsultinggroup.com or email us at info@currentconsultinggroup.com, and visit our portal for the podcast, Currently Speaking. You can view past episodes. You can see the schedule for upcoming episodes. We've got more coming on oral fluid testing as well. And it's available wherever you normally listen or watch podcasts. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube, Amazon, Audible, etc., Apple, we're on all of those podcast platforms. So visit us there, like it, share it, and help us build up our followers. So thank you again for joining us. And this concludes this episode of Currently Speaking.